Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. I'm so excited to be with you tonight for a conversation about Vampires of El Norte, a Gothic romance set in the Rio Grande Valley during the turbulent 1840s. Before I introduce our esteemed guests, we have a short video from our event sponsor, AARP.
There's nothing quite like local. Local is celebrating at a festival in Hemisphere Park, or coffee with your San Antonio neighbors. It's volunteering to fight fraud or joining friends to advocate at City Hall downtown. Local is helping people have their voices heard or trying something new. That's why AARP is local, offering connections throughout San Antonio that can help your money, health, and happiness live as long as you do. Find us at aarp.org/local.
Okay, thank you, AARP. Let's meet our guests. We have with us Erica Prosper, First Lady of San Antonio and a native of the Rio Grande Valley. Erica is Senior Director of Customer Insights at HEB, and yes, she's the First Lady of San Antonio. She co-founded and was the 2016 chair of the Latina Leadership Institute and has led the creation of multiple education programming, youth entrepreneurship programming, and women's economic development white papers with Raising Texas, the Saber Institute, and Venture Lab. In 2019, she was named the San Antonio Business Journal's Woman of the Year and a Governor's Yellow Rose of Texas honoree. Since 2022, she has been a yearly regional panelist for the prestigious White House Fellows Program. She became a Dame d'Escoffier in 2023, the same year she received the Otley Award from the Mexican government. This is the highest honor given to a non-citizen for impact in promoting Mexican culture. She was the 2018 chairwoman of the San Antonio Hispanic Chamber of Commerce and serves or volunteers on multiple community and advisory boards aimed at empowering Hispanic women, nonprofits, and voting. And full disclosure, she's on MACRI's National Advisory Council. Welcome, Erica.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Daniel Ibarra. Daniel is the Chief of Interpretation at Palo Alto Battlefield National Historical Park. With over 22 years of experience in the National Park Service, he currently oversees interpretation, education and outreach, and visitor services at the park. In addition, Daniel serves as the park's public information officer and works with a variety of partners and cooperators. He believes strongly in the power of stories to help people connect with places, ideas, and each other. Daniel is a lifelong resident of Brownsville, Texas. Welcome, Daniel. And next we have Carmen Alvarez. Carmen is the daughter of Cuban immigrants and a digital creator from Florida whose love of reading and passion for literacy drives her online presence. She makes book recommendations and gives reading tips on her TikTok and Instagram pages and uses her enthusiasm for her vintage clothing collection to capture the eye of those who may not usually seek out books to try to convert them into becoming lifelong readers. While her focus is mainly on Latinx books, she constantly fills her social media pages with books by BIPOC and LGBTQ+ authors. She lives in Tampa with her husband and 2 dogs. Welcome, Carmen.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Well, I know we have a lot to discuss with this book. First, I want to acknowledge that, Carmen, you're the reason I knew about this book. I follow you, and I think I read a lot of Sylvia Moreno Garcia and things like that. So this book kind of aligned with that genre-wise, but set in my backyard. So it was very exciting, and I have learned a lot about books from you. So thank you for being here. We have an exciting conversation, so let's dive in. Okay, so this book, it collides with the start of the U.S.-Mexican War and takes us into multiple genres. So I think the first thing to discuss is the way this book tackles or combines, weaves together romance with a horror or supernatural type story, and also historical fiction. And so, Erica, I know this is an area or type of book that you like. Can you talk to us a little bit about the genre and and how you see this book working as sort of a genre piece.
Yes, I have been for many years now an avid reader and a student of Frank Yerby, which was one of the country's best known historical fiction romance novelists. He started in the 40s. He was the first Black man to actually have his book made into a movie, The Foxes of Harrow. And eventually he would complete about 33 books, most of them dealing with the South and the stuff that happened in the South. What I think is interesting about historical romance fiction is that the story of the romance itself is a way to move the story forward, but the context of the love story always is put against the history. So in some of the books of this genre, for example, there might be a couple that is struggling, or a love triangle. And while you're invested in, yes, at the end, who does he end up? What you're really reading for is how does the surrounding aspect of their life actually affect their decisions of whether or not they can be together. And I thought this book did a really good job, because if you think about the turn of the century, the caste system that was still in Mexico haciendas, and the fact that he was a peon, or at least he was considered a vaquero peon, and she was of the hacienda. Oh, excuse me, my dog this too. That I think follows along with the genre of using the history to give you context as to why the romance may or may not work out.
Mhm, mhm. And Carmen, you read a lot of books. How do you see this fitting into a genre, in particular, that Latinx authors use?
So, what I thought was so interesting and compelling about this book is that, in a sense, it defies genres because it's a little bit of a lot of different genres, and it's so seamlessly put all those things together. And with the lack of Latinx representation in publishing, to see a book that can do so much and fly so high in its execution of a romance, of a paranormal, of a vampire story that also fits in like colonization and all of these issues. I was so impressed by this book, incredibly so.
Daniel, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I just thought it was great, just because I'm kind of looking at the book. I mean, first, I enjoyed the book. It was great. Um, but as a tool to, introduce people to this pivotal, battle, this conflict that had and continues to have consequences, and two countries that are still feeling the effects of as a result of the conflict. I think it was great to be able to have this book as a resource, really, to introduce people to a subject that oftentimes, and I'll tell kids that come by on field trips, history can be kind of dry. There are history enthusiasts out there, I don't deny that want to know exactly, how many yards away was company A from company B. But for the most part, and that's why I say what I say and believe what I believe about stories, is that's a more natural way for us to communicate is through stories. And so to have this book convey, what was probably going on at the time. And for me, that was really what impacted, or had the most impact on me, is to realize and then think back with my historian brain. It's like, okay, yes, there is a conflict breaking out. There are two armies facing off against each other, but there's also people living their everyday lives with more immediate needs and concerns. It may not be these two countries that are going at war, but people have to feed each other. People have to find each other. And all that is going on at the same time, and that was great, to be able to be pulled back a little bit by this book, and kind of step back as a maybe not so much as a historian, but really to think about the people that are in this place at that time.
We're going to dive into the history more in a minute, but first I would like for us to maybe set a stage for our viewers about the setting of the book. So the book, yes, it's set in the 1840s in South Texas, and one of the things that I found compelling was the imagery that the author used. She went into great detail describing the landscape, describing the setting of the ranch where the story opens. So it opens up at this Rancho Los Azuelos, and the family that runs the ranch has had this land in their family for a number of generations. There are all these vaqueros who work on the ranch and who have kept the ranch profitable. But at the same time, we're talking about post 1836. So at this point, Texas has declared its independence from Mexico, but Texas is not yet part of the United States. It is still its own sort of uh, independent space, depending on who you ask, right? So because the Mexican government doesn't necessarily agree with that perspective. But that is the setting, and I'm just wondering, particularly for somebody like you, Erica, somebody who grew up in the valley, did any of that imagery resonate with you, or was it set so far in the past that it was, maybe, not all of us grew up in the Chaparral?
No, no. The funny thing about it is, in the valley, once you leave the immediate valley, you go and you have to cross hours of what I assume was Chaparral, which of course we know in modern history as parts of the King Ranch, really, and the whole Falfurrias area as you kind of go to that first checkpoint. So anyone who's gone through the Falfurrias checkpoint and they look left and they look right, that is in essence a Chaparral, a little more tame than I'm
Mhm.
sure it was back in the day. And that was one of the things that I think intrigued me, was that I could recognize landmarks based on where they were talking about, south of San Antonio, but north of Matamoros. And they talked about where the springs come together, where the Brazos. So in my mind, I could kind of picture it, but I thought the power of, and I'm sure Danny will give us more perspective, I thought the power of it was, it reminded me that there was a point in history where Texas wasn't all the way down to the valley, that there was a strip of land that was not just Mexican, but was rightfully owned by families. And that this was working land. In other words, that people had settled in areas, but the rest was still, like you said, naturally wild and unexplored, and even, to a certain degree, easy to claim if there were no fences. Like, they didn't have fences back then, as rancheros
Mhm.
knew based on their brand. So I thought it was a really intriguing thing. So I would say that, yeah, I think any modern valleyite who travels north of the valley knows what the chaparral looks like, from basically knowing that Falfurrias checkpoint is almost the most perfect way to describe it.
And Daniel, if you were to go today to the battlefield site, do you see javelinas and all these other animals that she describes?
Yeah, you do. And thinking back through the book, just about everything that she talked about, it's one of the quotes that we like here, and it still remains true to a large extent. Um, is everything at the park either has a thorn or a stinger on it, or it'll bite you. We're lucky that we're able to preserve this site. The park owns about 1,800 acres. And it's unfortunately one of the last few stands of native brushland that you can find. But luckily, if you are in the valley, it doesn't, take a lot of work to find some chaparral, some monte, so to speak. Um, so that was pretty neat, and reading the book, and I can hear the chicharras. It's summertime when you hear the chicharras going. Um,
Hmm.
but no, a lot of the wildlife, a lot of the flora around here. I mean, we do spend a considerable amount of time and resources to maintain the battlefield and its 1846 appearance. So what's being described in the book, I can look outside the visitor center, and it's there.
And Carmen, I know you're not from South Texas, you're from Florida, but one other aspect of the setting that Isabel Cañas creates in her novel is a language setting, I think. The fact that in the book, it was originally published in English with some words and phrases in Spanish. It now has a Spanish edition and
Mhm.
fully in Spanish. But when you're reading the English one, it's clear that the characters are actually speaking to each other in Spanish. Nena, the primary female character, is shocked when she finds out that Nestor, the main male character, speaks English. And she's like, how did you learn that language? And so I think it's interesting that she's creating this environment in which Spanish is the language of the space, right? And is that something that resonated with you?
It is. I only speak Spanish to my family, and so to me, to have like I didn't catch it at first, right? Because I'm, like, always thinking and trying to speak in English, but when she's shocked that he learns English and you're like, "Oh, these 9 years have passed," and of course he's learned English because he's traversing the countryside, um, I was like, "Oh, they're only speaking in Spanish," and I felt like that was a little wink and a nod to all the readers who are Spanish speakers, like, this is for us, and this story was written for us, by us, and so I found it very exciting that, like, my head would start translating some of their conversations and things into Spanish a little bit after that point in the book.
Yeah, and they do use, Spanish and, the characters do use Spanish, or the author writes some things in Spanish that just seem, I don't know, almost natural, like it makes sense for those things to be in Spanish. Certainly the names of different, uh, natural, things, like she
Mhm.
keeps referencing the
Yeah,
chaparral,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
But
Well, and I think
oh, go ahead.
the word susto, because I think susto
Yes.
in English, to say a bit there, it doesn't have the same mystical, quite frankly, fear that the actual word susto is when you were growing up as a Latino, Latinx. When your abuela was like, "Te va a dar el susto," and you would know the demonic nature of it. So I think that one, I'm super glad she never changed it to English.
And how many times do they exclaim "Santa Madre"? Dramatic. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in talking about the characters, I wanted to ask each of you, was there a character that you related to most? Anyone? Abuela? Okay, I'm gonna go with Abuela.
Well,
The one
I
who's been
Uh,
telling, right, because Abuela's been telling them these stories, which are really like knowledge embedded into stories, and they haven't really been paying attention. So I thought that was good.
I thought I related to her because I have a living abuela. She's 101 and she did grow up telling me all of these stories. El cucuy, el susto. She also used to use homeopathic medicine and sobar and all these things. So she to me was the one I could gravitate to, and I could almost see her. When she was weeping at the not to ruin the book, but at the end when he's banned, she's weeping, and I understand why she would weep. This child of hers that she helped to raise.
Mhm.
Nina, to a certain degree, obviously, I live in a very different century than Nina, and so I don't have the same kind of like restraints. But the understanding of your duty as a Latina woman in a household that's more restrictive, I think I'm still from a generation where there was expectations of marriage and children and all these things that you know um, did not come to pass exactly as my family wanted it in a way, but at the same time, I could relate to that. And then I could relate, believe it or not, to Nestor. I grew up as a very poor farm worker. I could relate to the caste system within the Latino community in terms of hierarchy of your position with regards to your means. So I actually did love the fact that there were multiple characters that I really enjoyed getting to know, and that I could see areas of my modern life in them.
I'm gonna parrot a lot of what Erica said because I felt the same way. Like not the same century, like with Nena, for example, struggling to live up to the expectations of her parents. But I feel like a lot of her struggles were very universal. She's a little spoiled at the beginning, and she kind of comes into herself towards the end. And I didn't necessarily relate to Nestor 100%. Maybe like we grew up poor and all these things, but like I think like he's the heart of the book for me because I found him for being such a tough cowboy. He was also such a on Book Talk we call them cinnamon rolls, but just a very, gruff exterior with like just a big heart, and you just wanted to hug him and tell him everything was going to be okay. I found like he felt like a little brother, someone I would really deeply want to care for, a little cousin or something like that. And I think the same thing with the abuela. I never knew either of my abuelas, so I always am drawn to abuelas who are trying to give their knowledge and to, instill like this is what's going on, and like I'm trying to tell you what is right, and like no one's, we're not paying attention, we're not picking up on things. We have to grow a little bit and let that kind of be like a seed in the ground and grow within us. And so I loved abuela as well. I felt like Nena's parents, I was like, they're the villains, they're terrible. I couldn't find redeeming qualities, but I also saw them like I saw my parents when I was younger. I was like, I don't understand why they're like this. And then the older you get, the more you're like, I understand that they were just trying to do the best given their circumstances and whatnot too. So
Yeah.
yeah, all very compelling and lovely.
How about
Yeah,
you,
yeah.
Daniel?
It was a combination of Nena and Nestor for me. I guess the Gen Xer in me can see identify with her wanting to break with tradition, and essentially just asking why do things have to be the way they are, which I really liked a lot. Kind of almost bringing a common sense approach to the rancho. Is like, just because things have been a certain way doesn't mean that is the best way. They should continue to be that way, which I really like. And with Nestor, only because I find myself being that way, especially when it comes to family. When pointed in a certain direction, or with a certain goal in mind, which is whatever that might be, ensuring someone's safety, or in this case, Nena. He's almost, I wouldn't say mindless, but that is his sole focus, and everything else kind of falls away. As long as Nena is safe, even if it means that he may lose out on being with her, it almost doesn't matter, because that is his sole focus. And I was I can identify with that, having felt that way, because once you're talking about family, and I don't know, maybe it is a cultural thing, I'm not sure, but it's almost like nothing else matters. That is what you need to accomplish, whether to help someone out through a tough time or whatever it is. That is your sole focus, and you'll worry about yourself later.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about some of the real world things that are in the book, that some of the history. So before we even get to the Battle of Palo Alto, before we get to that kind of big battle scene, early in the book, it is established that there is this tension and anxiety around the presence and increasing presence of Yankees in Texas. And I want to read a short passage from early on. This is chapter 5, and it reads, "All her life, Yankees circled overhead like vultures. First, they tore off pieces at the edges of her world. Nestor and his family fled from San Antonio, bringing nightmarish tales with them. Then came news that Anglos had declared Texas independent of Mexico, its own nation. Now that they were a part of the United States and set their eyes further south, would they sink their talons into Los Abuelos next? She would never forget the men who long ago came to speak to Papa in their broken Spanish, asking after land for sale. How shifty their pale eyes were, how untrustworthy. So she's already establishing that there's just this incredible anxiety around the arrival of more Americans into Texas. And so I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts were about how she's setting that up. And also, we can go around, but for Daniel in particular, I would really like to know how accurate is this? Was this kind of anxiety really that widespread?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I wouldn't say that it was, across the board, but there definitely was a sense of urgency with what at the time was the frontier. Uh, I mean, everything from Texas all the way to California at this particular time was, in essence, pretty sparsely populated, and that was part of Mexico's problem with maintaining, a claim to. It sounds kind of strange, but maintaining a claim to their own country was there weren't enough people there. So even afterwards, after these battles, we'll skip ahead a little bit. These opening battles are over, and General Mariano Arista, who commanded the Mexican army here at Palo Alto, when he's in Mexico City, essentially at his court-martial, he's his defense is, I've been telling you for years, our frontier is not very well defended. The Americans are coming. They're going to be on our doorstep eventually. And I've been asking for money, for men, for supplies, and you haven't given that to me. And so in essence, his defense for the battles, his performance at the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma was essentially, I did what I could with what I had, and it wasn't enough. So that definitely is in the minds of, not just the civilians in the area, but military, the military that's here. But you also have a bit of an independent spirit. You kind of see some of that in the book when the I guess the elders are talking, and it's like we can take care of ourselves essentially. We've been doing it ourselves, and you have some of that spirit already in Texas for sure, obviously, but also in California. At the onset of this war, a lot of people in California are essentially considering themselves Californios. It's like we're not even going to think about that we're part of Mexico, because we've been doing it on our own this whole time, and we'll continue to do that. And now they have the U.S. Army on their doorstep, and so that's what's happening here. Is you have this unease of people not getting the support that they feel that they should have gotten from the Mexican government, and now they have this foreign army on their doorstep. Is how are you going to do this? And like, yes, your allegiance and your devotion to your country are going to lead you to join forces and call up these companies of irregular cavalry, which was present here at Palo Alto. But then, and that's a problem that that the Mexican army faces later, is you have these armies, Mexican armies, that a lot of people and a lot of the soldiers in these armies aren't quite sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, because at the end it's like, well, okay, I'm going to help you fight this war, but what have you done for us? And if we win, what are you going to do for us then? So, but yes, you do have concerns already with the approach. Yes, speculators that are in the area, almost following the U.S. Army, knowing that they're hedging their bet that the U.S. will win this war, and now you have all this property that's going to be up for grabs. How they acquire it, that's a whole nother story. You know, some will say that it was acquired legally. Others will contest that. You know, namely, and he's mentioned, I believe, at least once, Juan Cortina, who was here at the Battle of Palo Alto as a teenager. He's part of the irregular cavalry. His mother, I mean, owned this whole tract that most of all of Brownsville is on right now, and so you know you have this you know, just people not sure of what they're fighting against is really any worse than what they've been living with to date.
You know, and I think that that sets up a really interesting thing, because I think that what we see in that of, well, I'm not feeling like I'm part of Mexico because I have to take care of myself, not American. I think that echoes a lot of Mexican American identity struggles and the tension between these two backgrounds and these two cultures that are always feels like they're always in tension to a certain degree. You know, I'm not going to quote the famous Selena movie, but I think the whole point, as Daniel pointed out, is if you know, if the identity of the entire South Texas was already in between. So even though the tensions were rising, they already felt like an other, and they were already feeling a little bit like, where do I sit in this world between these two countries that are coming together? And I think in some ways that still continues to echo the Mexican American identity in Texas, the South Texas identity.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, of course, through all this, you also have indigenous people present who could care less if it was the U.S. or Mexico, because neither one belonged. So it really is a layered, very layered story. You know, part of the issues that Mexico is having in this particular region, where the battle took place, is that they're fighting a war against the United States, but they're also in a prolonged war with Apache tribes, and it's, you know, you have people in these ranchos that are now, you know, having to, I guess, defend themselves on multiple fronts while making a living and making a go of their life.
Well, Daniel, can you just explain to us, without, you know, uh, it's taking an hour, but what happened at the Battle of Palo Alto?
So essentially, you know, really condense it. You have the U.S. Army arrives on the riverbanks directly across from Matamoros. If you're familiar with the Brownsville area or not, you can look it up. Essentially, they set up operations behind the campus of the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. So you have this U.S. Army that is staring right across the river at the Mexican garrison in Matamoros. War's not officially declared yet, but you know, something is eventually going to happen. You have a general, an experienced general on the U.S. side, General Zachary Taylor, who is, you know, I wouldn't say that he was sent out kind of to take the rap for something, but President Polk kept his instructions, I think, a bit vague on purpose, maybe to cover himself. But his instructions to Taylor is to pick a location near or on the Rio Grande, but that was up to him. Taylor chose that particular spot. So he begins construction of this fort. His supply base is up at what is now Port Isabel. So you have supplies that are landing on what is now South Padre Island to support a prolonged, I guess, occupation. And that's what Taylor's army is known as at the time. It started as the Army of Observation while they were in Corpus Christi, but now that they're on the riverbanks, they are now the Army of Occupation. General Mariano Arista arrives in late April in Matamoros and decides that Taylor is at least 150 miles into Mexico, if not more so. So he makes plans to cross the river. Taylor can kind of see that this is what the plan is. So he leaves with a major part of his army to secure his supply base at Port Isabel and leaves a token force behind at the fort. Um, the Mexican army starts to lay siege to this fort. Taylor makes his return trip to the fort. And Arista knows that Taylor's going to want to get to his fort. So he sets up his main body at what at that time was one of the few clearings in the area because of the chaparral was so dense at what was known as Palo Alto. And so, the strategy by Arista is simple. Is like, he's telling Taylor, if you want your fort, you're going to have to go through us. And so you have this duel that's fought. The Battle of Palo Alto. It's essentially an artillery duel, and that's one of the things that stood out to me also about this book is you have talk of vampires being used as weapons, and what stood out really at the time, not just for this battle but for this entire war, is that the U.S. Army had available to them what at the time was the most, probably in the world, most advanced field artillery. So the Mexican army just could not compete. They had numbers on their side. They outnumbered the U.S. Army by at least 1,000 troops, but their technology, weapons technology, was 50 to 60 years old. And so there was no way for them to compete against what at the time was like the unmanned drone of the day, the latest smartphone. I mean, that's how advanced this weapons technology was. So, instantly when I'm reading the books, like those are the vampiros, these very advanced field artillery. And you have this duel that breaks out, but unfortunately for the Mexican army, they just can't compete. They put 3,200 soldados on the field that day, and they lost at least 150 killed in action. There are reports that say it's really closer to 400. Taylor fields 2,300 soldiers. He only loses 9 that day. Both armies, at the end of the day, you got to keep in mind, this is 1846, 19th century warfare. When the sun goes down, that's the end of your day. There's no such thing as night fighting. That's when you go out and you tend to your wounded, you're dead and you're dying. The following day, the fight picks back up, but Arista chooses to move the fight about 5 miles south of Palo Alto, heading back towards Matamoros at what is Resaca de la Palma. What was a traditional 19th century style line and column battle of Palo Alto, the Resaca del Palma, it's at times literal hand-to-hand combat. You have small detachments of soldiers going off into the brush, into the chaparral, where sometimes it was even difficult to maneuver with a musket. So you really are going in there with your fist and bayonet sometimes. That was where I would consider the Battle of Palo Alto more of a stalemate. Neither army gave up the field of battle. The Battle of Resaca del Palma was an outright defeat of the Mexican army. I mean, they're literally running for the river. They're streaming past the fort that Taylor had erected, which would later become Fort Brown, and they're making a beeline for Matamoros. Taylor attempts to follow, but he doesn't have the supplies. He had been asking for pontoon bridges to be able to cross the river and more ferries and things of that nature, but the U.S. government was a little bit slow in getting them that. So while essentially the first battles are over by May 9th, Taylor doesn't cross the Matamoros until May 18th. And from then on, he continues his push on into northern Mexico, and that's kind of Taylor's theater of operations in northern Mexico. And that is really the last time that the Mexican army officially operated in what is now U.S. soil until relief efforts for Hurricane Katrina. That's when they crossed back. That's how big of a moment this was. This cascade of dominoes that started a siege of northern Mexico, with the aim of getting Mexico to sell what is now essentially the U.S. Southwest. That didn't work. It became obvious to President Polk, Taylor, and Winfield Scott that the only way to get Mexico to agree to the sale is to capture the capital. And so that's what's agreed upon, a secondary campaign. Salt of Veracruz, siege of Veracruz. Once that city falls, the national highways open. Essentially the same path Cortes took, hundreds of years before. And then once the capital falls, if you're Mexico, your army's disbanded, your capital has fallen, your flag has been taken down, and the Stars and Stripes is flying over the Zocalo. And the U.S. government then says, "Will you sell us this territory?" It kind of forces your hand a bit to enter peace negotiations, and that's what happens. A fairly quick war. May 8th, 1846 is the Battle of Palo Alto. Last official combat is in September 13th of 1847. And then the peace treaty is signed in February of 1848. The last U.S. troops end up leaving that summer. So fairly quick turnaround. And at the end, you have, 1,000,000 square miles that officially go from, being Mexico to being the United States. In a nutshell, that's the U.S.-Mexican War.
So huge consequences, huge consequences. Okay. You mentioned the vampires, and I think that in telling us that big history, we have to talk about the vampires as a metaphor, because in the story, yes, vampires are real supernatural beings, but also the vampires, to your point, Daniel, they're metaphors for what's happening. Um, and I know that this is not Isabel Cañas is not the first person to use a vampire as a metaphor, and so let's go to Carmen. What do you have to say about the vampire as a metaphor?
Well, I think we're not spoiling anything. It's in the title of the book, right? It's Vampires of El Norte. So I love that she doesn't even try to hide it. She's like, it is a metaphor, but I'm telling you from the start, this is what it is. And so um I loved the use of them and the way they transformed into all of these different uses, like in the war. And I don't know if it's okay to spoil a little bit, but just at the end when she looks across the river and there's the vampire there and she just acknowledges, and it's like that's the foreshadowing for the history that Daniel just told us. So I thought it was very simple and poetic use of the vampires, and how they're sucking blood, they're taking all of this from us. And I loved how she used the physical attacks of the vampire on humans as also like the United States taking Mexico. I thought it was very just beautifully and poetically done.
Mm-hmm. I thought, it's funny because I remember when I read at the very end this idea of the wild avarice that led the vampires, the Juan Cortina quote, right? The wild avarice. And I thought, in a way, at the first part of the, that's really what it sort of sets the vampires to be, this wild creatures that cannot get enough thirst for the blood. To your point, all the metaphors that were used, that cannot get enough thirst for the land, for the blood, for whatever they can take. Um, and then I thought it evolved a little bit more, to me, when I realized that they were, that they were weapons to a certain degree, that they weren't wild beasts, but they were targeted weapons. I started thinking my metaphor for them. I'm not as versed as Daniel in the warfare portion of it. So my metaphor for them became nature. How they're like how the U.S. Army used the nature, the land itself, against the rancheros. The idea that it was a wild place, the idea that there weren't fences, the idea that it was a no man's land to be taken. And so I felt like it's almost like for me the vampires became the nature that in some respects they depended on and they loved and they tended to, but it was being turned against them because there was no real ownership of it, and because it was still quite wild and it was still stinging, biting, or as Daniel mentioned, stuff that they couldn't necessarily tame. So I thought it was a beautiful use of them, honestly. I mean, I was like everyone, I was scared at first, and then later I felt almost really bad for for them. They came to represent the land.
And also there are just little flashes. I don't know that this gets totally fleshed out, but there are little flashes where the vampires are also symbolic of the enslavement of African Americans, right? The way that they're in chains and this collars, and that they're being used as weapons and tools to do nefarious things for the army. So that, yeah, she really layered it in there. Um, uh, Somebody did ask about their breath. I have to tell you, I can't recall. Did they have bad breath?
Yes, like Rod.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, they did have bad breath. Um, let's see. And I went ahead and I put that one Cortina quote in the chat for our audience in case they hadn't seen that in some of our lead up to the advertising for this. We did include that quote because it, Daniel just mentioned a few minutes ago that the Cortina family owned a big swath of that area around Brownsville. So for them, this was incredibly personal. Cortina, of course, leads an attempt at a rebellion. And I also just want to point out some other characters in the story who only had a short piece, and yet I think they were very historically important. And that was the carreteras, the cart drivers. So at one point, Nena and Nestor are fleeing, and they run into a group of cart drivers or carreteras, and they are able to take refuge with them for a night. And they swap stories. And in fact, um, later, one site of resistance against Anglo incursion in Texas, when folks were trying to basically take the jobs of the carreteros. These are people who would take carts of goods across Texas and sell them, trade them. Um, and it became kind of a competition and sometimes violent. And so there was something called the cart wars, where these people tried to resist having their livelihoods taken away, and also the violence that was unleashed towards some of the cart drivers. So they made a little cameo, I thought, in the story. I do want to talk about these um, consequences. The end of the story, and without giving, I guess, too much away, but I just hope if you haven't read the book yet that you will, that this will make you think I need to read this. I will just say that I felt that at the end, Nena and Nestor were a little ambivalent, ambiguous. I'm not sure what the word is, but almost resigned to, okay, the Anglos are coming. Maybe it won't be that bad. Did you notice that?
Yeah, it was unsatisfactory with regards to the history setup and the conflict. I'm not going to disagree with you. It was almost kind of like they settled into the suburbia version of whatever that time period was, with at the end, or they did just kind of, it's almost like they just went back to themselves, and they just just did not want to hear. I almost felt a little bit like they were all of us right now during the election. Sometimes it's just so much chaos, so much change, so much danger, so much everything, that you almost just kind of go back and into your little space. And so I agree with you. I was not satisfied with the ending from that perspective. I was like, well, what happens next? Like, wait a minute, people out there that are coming, is the next wave coming? What is happening?
So oh,
No, go ahead.
sorry.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Carmen.
So Daniel earlier mentioned about how there's all of this turmoil happening around, but everyone's always like living their life, And I felt like because they had had such a fantastical journey, I felt like this was the romance part kind of kicking in of the book, which really the main purpose of a romance is to have the happily ever after. And so I felt like she was like, instead of ending it like a paranormal or this or a historical fiction, like straight historical fiction, she leaned into the romance and the happily ever after. And so as someone who read it as a mostly romance reader with an interest in the history, I was satisfied, but I could also see there being like a second book of the consequences of what happens in the first.
A second book. Yes, let's put that out into the universe. A second book. Okay. I want to before we run out of time, I want to acknowledge a couple of questions from Jesse. He wants to know, given the historical accuracy of land displacement, segregation, subjugation, exploitation, over policing, mass incarcerating, lynching, and erasure of ethnic Mexicans in the Tejas region since before 1836 at the hands of colonizers, dare I call Cañas's book historical fiction? What do you think?
Well,
I think
I would say that it still captures the heart of a very specific part of history. So I think you could still call it part of the larger story of history. And honestly, when we discuss history, we always talk about the winners get to tell the story. So tonight's a good example. I never heard of the Battle of Palo Alto. I'm from the Valley. I never heard about the Battle of Palo Alto. And so in some respects, this opened up for that slit of history for me to now be aware, for me to go find out about it, and for me to have a higher awareness of, okay, this happened in my home region. What else happened before then, right? And so it's a great message. It's a great question. Agree with you, Jesse, that you know that it's fiction is a loose word. I think the fiction aspect comes from the romance, vampire, fantastical portion of it. But that's why it's to be a true historical fiction novel, you actually do have to ground it and have that fiction, like I mentioned, again, be an impetus for the romance. And I feel she did a very good job by using the history to push the fiction forward. So I think it does qualify from a literary standpoint as historical romance, but I agree with you that it's probably a really good idea to explore every single part of the history that she mentions here. And now that I know about the Carretera War, I'm going to go read about the Carretera War, and I want to know whether or not there were women ranchers like La Viuda from Laredo. Was there a
Mhm.
rancher that was based on that I don't know about? So I have to go and research that too.
Yeah. So, Daniel, if folks want to go and visit the Palo Alto battlefield, what do they need to know? What do they need to do?
Well, first of all, we're a fee-free park, so we're always free. The park itself is open 7 days a week, with the exception of some days throughout the year. Currently, the visitor center is open Tuesday through Saturday, and we're about to enter our heavy ranger program season. But we've already started doing living history and historic weapons programs. So those typically run from September through May, the second Saturday of every month. I myself don't wear this uniform on that day, and so it's myself and some of our volunteers will put on period dress and perform weapons demonstrations, camp life, and talk to people. And that's a really unique way to connect. When I was reading the book and the descriptions of, you smell the saltpeter and the sulfur in the air. It's one thing for me to talk to someone about a cannon, for an hour, but if I can fire it and they can smell that, they can go up to the barrel afterwards and kind of feel a little bit of the residual heat. That's great. But no, definitely, it's a great place. Even if you're not a history enthusiast, to come and see, what unfortunately is what one of the few remaining stands of native brushland. We're home to some threatened species: Texas tortoise, Texas horned lizard. We're a great bird watching spot, if that's what you're into, for sure. And our visitation pretty much now is about an even split from is the history enthusiasts and the nature enthusiasts and people that just want to get out and recreate and have fun and go walk on the trail and be healthy.
And Carmen, if people like this book, what should they read next?
Okay, I was afraid you were going to ask me that, so I've made some notes. because this book defies and goes across so many genres, I'm just going to go very quickly, but I'm going to actually make a TikTok and explain why I'm recommending these. So, the first is if you haven't read Isabel's first book, it's called The Hacienda. It's a perfect spooky season read. There's a haunted house, and then there's like a hot priest thing going on. It's a wild book. Then if you like the romance aspect, Liana de la Rosa's Luna Sister series, Ana Maria and the Fox, and Isabel and the Rogue. There's 2 books. There's a third one, I think, going to be published. And this is about sisters who escape I believe it's French occupied Mexico. Please correct me if I'm incorrect here. And they go to London, and they're kind of they're trying to get the British involved in the war, and there's tons of history in that book, and they're romances, and they're very different romances. They're delightful. Silvia Moreno Garcia, one of my favorite Mexican Canadian authors, wrote a retelling of the Isle of Dr. Moreau called The Daughter of Dr. Moreau. This takes place in Yucatan Peninsula and talks about like the ongoing, like the colonization there, and it was fascinating. And there's this like sci-fi element with the different animals that are being created, and it's also told from the perspective of Dr. Moreau's daughter. And then there's a wonderful Mexican Western. It takes place multiple timelines, one of which is 1895. And it's called The Bullet Swallower by Elizabeth Gonzalez James. And then one more book about storytelling, and then I'll be done. That takes place in 1920s Denver. So it does move up quite a bit, but it's called Woman of Light by Cali Fajardo Anstein. And it's a beautiful multi-generational story. It goes back, I think, into the 1860s or 1870s, as well as 1920s Denver. And it is fascinating. So, and then that's it. I'll make a TikTok and I'll explain why I picked all these. I promise.
Those all sound wonderful. I've read The Daughter of Dr. Moreau, but I haven't read any of those others, so I've got some reading to do. Okay. Well, I want to thank you for your time. Did anybody have any other burning things they need to say about this book? Get it? It's really fun and fascinating. I have to say, I was telling Daniel before that military history isn't really my thing. I love history, but just military history isn't really my thing. But I felt like, to Erica's point, after reading this, I need to know more about this battle. So I hope it might be a way of getting more people to know about the battle, but in particular, thinking about the long-term consequences, particularly in terms of land rights, voting rights, water rights, all these rights that come into question when we see the big handover of all this land that had been Mexico. So thank you to our guests. What a fantastic conversation. I do just want to say we have a bunch more stuff coming up for you. Plus, I want to plug a friend of ours, Hector Galan, MACRI speaker from a previous symposium of ours, is premiering his new documentary, Our Texas, Our Vote, on PBS tonight. So for those of us in Central Time, it'll be at 9 o'clock. And if you're in the other time zones, it's at 10 o'clock on PBS, Our Texas, Our Vote. Again, our friend Hector Galan has a new documentary. And if you're from Texas, you're going to recognize a lot of people who are in this documentary. And then over at MACRI, we have 2 more virtual events for you this week. Tomorrow, we're going to be learning about Arizona and contemporary struggles for Latino rights in Arizona with our special guest, Randy Paraz. This is a lunch and learn. It's at noon Central. And on Friday, we have another lunch and learn with Dr. Rogelio Sáenz, who's going to be talking to us about the Texas Latino electorate. As for those of you who haven't seen Dr. Sáenz with us before, he's a demographer. He knows all about numbers, and he's going to tell us about numbers going into this election season here in Texas. So please join us for a future event. We love chatting with you about civil rights history. Did you know we're building the first national museum dedicated to Mexican American civil rights? Yes, and we need your support. Please follow us on social media, subscribe to our newsletter. You can find all that information on our website, somosmacri.org. I want to thank our sponsors for tonight's event, AARP. Thank our guests again. Thank all the people who tuned in for tonight. Have a great night, everybody.